Grand
This
Admiral
is our
Ossvei Thal
final
watched the last
warning.
transmission from Earth's
Withdraw your
ambassador loop
fleet
for the ninth
or
time,
face
and for the
total
ninth time
annihilation.
he laughed. It was a short, ugly sound in the war chamber of the Voraxi
You are
Compact's
in no
flagship,
position to
echoing off
threaten
walls
us.
built from the bones of 6 conquered species, trophies his predecessors had mounted as reminders of every doctrine that had never once failed the Compact in 3 centuries. On the display before him, a human diplomat named Ambassador Renata stood at a podium before the Compact's assembled war council, her voice steady, despite the weight of every alien eye fixed on her, unblinking beneath the scrutiny of a species that had never once bothered to learn her name before this moment. What Thal did not know, what no one in that chamber knew, was that Cho had buried her own brother 18 months earlier, a survey officer killed in one of the very border raids the Compact's War College had celebrated as harmless probing. She was not speaking as a diplomat that day. She was speaking as a woman who had already paid the price of being underestimated once and had sworn she would not watch her people pay it again. Humanity does not want this conflict, she had said, 3 weeks earlier, in a chamber that had gone silent out of curiosity rather than respect. We have shown you restraint you mistake for weakness. We have absorbed your border raids, your seized colonies, your murdered scouts, and answered with diplomacy instead of retaliation. I am telling you plainly, on behalf of my government, that this restraint has a limit. If you cross it, we will not negotiate a second time. The Compact's War Council had laughed her out of the chamber, dismissing her words as the empty posturing of a species too soft to back up its own threats. Thal was still laughing now, 3 weeks later, as his armada prepared to burn the human colony of New Meridian to ash, a strike meant to answer humanity's warning with a message of their own. Threats mean nothing from a species too civilized to act on them. He had no idea, in that moment, that he was already looking at the last thing that would ever make him laugh again. That somewhere in that quiet, unshaken human face was the last warning his species would ever receive before the cost of ignoring it became permanent. 6 hours later, Grand Admiral Thal would watch his flagship's reactor core breach in real time, would watch 41 Voraxi warships die in the dark, without ever identifying what killed them, and would understand, in the final seconds before his own consciousness winked out beneath a wave of directed energy he never saw coming, that Ambassador Cho had not been threatening him. She had been warning him, and he had mistaken mercy for fear one final fatal time. But none of this had begun with fire. It had begun 2 years earlier, with patience. The Voraxi Compact had spent 3 centuries expanding across the galaxy's outer arm through a doctrine as simple as it was effective: identify a weaker neighbor, provoke a manageable conflict, and absorb their territory once resistance collapsed. It had worked against 7 species already, each conquest validating the doctrine further, each new set of bones mounted in a war chamber, somewhere as proof that patience was for the weak and hesitation was for the conquered. When Voraxi scouts first encountered scattered human colonies along the Kestrel Belt, 2 years before Thal's fateful strike, the pattern seemed obvious. Humanity's colonies were sparse, poorly defended, spread thin across a dozen unconnected systems. Every metric the Compact's War College could produce suggested an easy, profitable war. What the Compact's analysts failed to account for was Fleet Admiral Naomi Osei, commander of humanity's Kestrel Frontier Defense, who had spent those same 2 years watching Voraxi provocations escalate with mounting, deliberate patience. Not because her government lacked the will to respond, but because she understood something the Compact's doctrine had never accounted for. A species that reveals its full strength too early gives its enemy time to adapt. A species that waits gives its enemy nothing but false confidence, right up until the moment that confidence becomes fatal. Osei had spent those 2 years building exactly that confidence, brick by brick, provocation by provocation, letting every dismissed warning and every underestimated colony feed a picture of weakness she had no intention of correcting until it mattered most. For 2 years, the Compact tested humanity's limits. Border skirmishes, seized mining outposts, the destruction of an unarmed survey vessel, that Compact War College analysts privately celebrated as proof humanity would never risk open war. Each provocation was met with the same measured human response: formal protest, diplomatic warning, and no visible military escalation, a pattern the Compact strategists read as confirmation of everything their doctrine had already told them to expect. The princess had overlooked one crucial detail in that pattern, though it would be Grand Admiral Thal himself, not any Voraxi royalty, who ultimately paid for the oversight. Humanity's restraint was never weakness. It was preparation. Ambassador Cho's final warning, delivered before the full Compact War Council, 3 weeks before the new Meridian strike, was humanity's last diplomatic effort to avoid the very war Thal was determined to start. When the Council dismissed her warning as theater, Cho returned to Earth's High Command with a single recommendation: activate a defense plan that had been quietly assembled for 18 months, waiting for exactly this moment. Nobody in the Compact's War College expected what happened next, because nobody had ever considered that humanity's scattered, undersupplied frontier colonies might be exactly what they appeared to be. Bait. Grand Admiral Thal's Armada translated into the new Meridian system with 41 warships, expecting to find the same thin defenses Compact intelligence had reported for 2 years. A handful of patrol craft, outdated weapons platforms, colonists with no meaningful capacity to resist. His scouts confirmed exactly that during the approach. New Meridian's visible defenses were, by any reasonable measure, negligible. That wasn't even the biggest surprise waiting for him. The moment his armada committed to attack formation, moving into range to begin the bombardment that would reduce New Meridian's surface to slag, every sensor aboard his flagship lit up with contacts that should not have existed. Cloaked beneath the colony's own gravitational shadow, invisible to 2 years of Compact reconnaissance, an entire human battle fleet, 43 vessels of a design Compact intelligence had never once catalogued, decloaked in perfect formation around his own ships. Impossible, Thal's tactical officer breathed, staring at a display suddenly flooded with hostile contacts he had no framework to explain. Admiral, their fleet's signature, it's not in any threat database. We have no targeting data, no weapon profiles, nothing. It's as though this fleet didn't exist until this exact moment. Then we adapt, Thal snapped, though even as he said it, some old survival instinct buried beneath 3 centuries of Voraxi conquest doctrine was screaming at him that adaptation would not be enough. All ships engage, we still outnumber them. Everything changed in the next few seconds. The human fleet did not simply engage. It executed a coordinated strike so precise it felt less like warfare and more like a demonstration, targeting the Compact Armada's weapons systems and engines with surgical accuracy, while leaving life support and crew quarters almost entirely untouched, ship after ship disabled rather than destroyed, as though humanity had spent 2 years not merely preparing to win, but preparing to win without needing to slaughter anyone who didn't force their hand. Thal's own flagship became the exception. His ship, the Voraxi Compact's most heavily armed vessel in the entire Armada, refused to disengage even as 38 of his 41 warships went dark around him, their weapons crippled, their crews alive but helpless. Thal, driven by 3 centuries of doctrine that equated retreat with annihilation of reputation, ordered a final, desperate charge directly at the human command vessel, convinced that killing their admiral would shatter the coordination that had dismantled his fleet so effortlessly. Aboard the UNS Solace Vigil, Fleet Admiral Osei watched the Voraxi flagship break formation and accelerate directly toward her position, weapons charging for what her tactical readouts confirmed was an all-or-nothing strike aimed squarely at her ship's reactor core. For one brief, unguarded moment, she thought of Cho, of the quiet, grieving woman who had stood alone before an alien war council and asked, one last time, for a peace her own brother would never get to see. Osei had promised her that peace would not come at the cost of becoming exactly what the Compact expected them to be. He's not going to stop, her first officer warned. Admiral, if that ship reaches firing range, he made his choice 3 weeks ago when he ignored Ambassador Cho's warning. Osei said quietly. her voice carrying none of the satisfaction the moment might have offered a less careful commander. Target his reactor. Minimal collateral. I don't want this to be a massacre, but I won't let him make it one either. The truth stunned the entire compact fleet in the final seconds before Thal's flagship died. The human strike that breached his reactor core wasn't overwhelming firepower unleashed without restraint. It was a single, devastatingly precise shot, fired only after every possible alternative had been exhausted, aimed at ending exactly one threat without expanding the death toll one ship further than absolutely necessary. Even in that final act of violence, humanity had chosen precision over vengeance. Grand Admiral Ossvei Thal's flagship died alone, the only Voraxi vessel destroyed in a battle that could have annihilated an entire armada, its wreckage tumbling silently among 38 crippled ships whose crews still breathed. The Council had made a terrible mistake dismissing Ambassador Cho's warning as theater, and the surviving Voraxi captains, 38 commanders left alive, weapons crippled but crews intact, drifting helpless in the wreckage of what should have been an easy conquest, understood that mistake with a clarity that would follow them for the rest of their careers. It was Captain Vesa Korin, senior surviving officer after Thal's death, who finally opened a channel to the human flagship. Her voice carrying the particular exhaustion of someone confronting a defeat she had never once considered possible, watching 38 crippled but living ships drift where an entire armada had once promised certain victory. Why, she asked, without preamble, did you spare us? Your fleet could have destroyed every ship in this armada. Doctrines says you should have. Admiral Osei considered the question with the same weight she'd given every decision in the 2 years leading to this moment, aware that whatever she said next would shape how an entire empire remembered this day. Because Ambassador Cho didn't warn your council to threaten you, Captain. She warned you because we didn't want this fight. We still don't. If we'd wiped out your entire armada today, your compact would have spent the next century building a fleet to avenge it, and we'd have spent that same century preparing for a war neither of us actually wants. Instead, you get to go home and tell your people the truth, that we could have ended every life in this fleet, and chose to end only the one that refused to stop. The Queen, for Vesa Korin, though a captain by rank, was in fact the second daughter of the Voraxi Compact's ruling monarch, a lineage she had concealed throughout her military career, to avoid preferential treatment, and the resentment it would have earned her, among crews who valued earned rank over inherited blood, suddenly froze, understanding in that moment that whatever she reported back to her mother's throne would reshape the Compact's entire relationship with the outside galaxy. I need to bring this back to my mother, Vesa said finally, her voice quieter now, stripped of the command authority she'd worn like armor throughout the battle. The Empress will want to hear this directly, not through a formal report, stripped of everything that actually happened here today. The formal peace negotiations that followed took the better part of a year, conducted not in the cold, transactional language of conquest and tribute, but in the harder, more honest language of two civilizations forced to reckon with doctrines that had nearly destroyed one and humbled the other beyond recognition. Ambassador Cho, vindicated in a way she took no visible pleasure in, became the architect of humanity's first lasting treaty with the Voraxi Compact. A treaty that began, at the Empress's own insistence, with a formal acknowledgement of the mistake that had nearly cost her daughter's life and her empire's future. An admission no Voraxi ruler had ever been willing to put into writing before. Fleet Admiral Naomi Osei never spoke publicly about Grand Admiral Thal's death, declining every request for comment on the man whose stubbornness had ended his own life, while sparing thousands of others aboard his fleet, deflecting every reporter and historian who tried to make him into either a villain or a cautionary tale. When pressed once, years later, by a young officer at humanity's new Frontier Command Academy, she offered only a single answer that would eventually be carved above the Academy's entrance hall. We didn't warn them because we wanted a war, she said, choosing each word with the same deliberate care she'd carried into every decision on the day New Meridian nearly burned. We warned them because we didn't. The tragedy isn't that they didn't believe us. It's that believing us would have cost them nothing, and not believing us cost them everything. The final line of the Compact's own historical record on the new Meridian engagement, added personally by the Empress upon Vessa's return, has been required reading for every Voraxi officer commissioned since. Carved not in triumph, but in the quiet, permanent language of a lesson an entire empire had nearly failed to survive learning. They told us exactly what would happen. We chose not to listen. Let this be the last time any of us makes that mistake somewhere on Earth. In a small garden behind a house that had once belonged to her brother, Ambassador Renata Cho read the treaty's final draft alone, under a sky that had never felt quieter. She did not celebrate, she simply pressed her hand flat against the cool stone marker bearing his name, the way she had every year since his death, and allowed herself, for the first time in 18 months, to believe that the warning she had carried for him had finally been heard.